Hello, and welcome to my messy car. Today, I wanted to talk about Things Fall Apart. It's a book by Chinua Achebe. I believe that's how it's pronounced. Chinua Achebe. He is a Nigerian author. He was a Nigerian author of Igbo origin. Igbo being one of the tribes, Nigerian tribes. There are three main tribes from what I understand. Yoruba, Igbo, and Hausa. Yeah, Hausa. And he is of Igbo origin. Now this is really one of the starting points. It's considered one of the monumental books, novels, as far as modern African literature. Now, pre-colonial African literature, I don't really think it was much of a thing. I might be wrong, though. But because most of the stories were passed down orally. I might be wrong, though. I haven't looked too much into this. But as far as modern African literature, from the turn of the 20th century, this book is really a monumental point. It was published in 1959. It was published in English, not in Igbo. And Achebe was educated in England, I believe. I'm fairly certain he was educated in England, and that's how he was able to write this book. Also, you know what? I might be wrong actually about that. My memory might be faltering. I'm not sure if he was educated in England. I might be mixing him up with a character in his novel. Not this novel, actually, another one. But anyway, he wrote it in English, and Things Fall Apart. That's the title of the book. A very ominous title. And rightfully so. This book is a tragedy. The title comes from the William Butler Yeats poem, The Second Coming. There are parts of the poem are right here. I'm not sure if this is the whole poem, if it's just 4 lines, or if this is part of the poem. But I'll read out this poem. Turning and turning into the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconeer. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. Let's say with a British accent. World. Yeah. And especially those last 2 lines. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. Are very much sentiments that are felt in this book. At least the second half of this book. Actually, I'll take that back. The whole book is pretty much laced with tragedy. Now, what does the book concern? Who does the book concern? What does it concern? It concerns Okonkwo, who is a very masculine, very dominant, tough leader, essentially, in his village. The village of, I believe it's Umofia. He's a very dominant, almost hyper-masculine man, and it really follows his story. He's a bit nuanced, though. He develops this hyper-masculine, warlike persona very much to compensate for his lazy father, kind of take it easy, not very urgent father. His father was very much a guy who accrued a lot of debt, and he wasn't very hardworking. And Okonkwo very much disliked his father and tried to distance himself from him. So then he developed a very hardworking, hypermasculine, in many ways, attitude. Farmed his yams. Yams is a man's food. Yams are a big deal. Farming is a big deal. Like I said, yams is the man food. And a lot of it, I shouldn't say a lot, but a good portion of the novel deals with the culture. Actually, I would say pretty much most of the first 2/3 of the novel concern culture in this tribe, this large, expansive. To just call it a minuscule tribe is not enough, because it's really many different cultures within these tribes that they share, and certain tribes have their own unique customs as well. And 2/3 of this novel really delves deep into these customs. And these are customs that many of them are incredibly foreign to Europeans. I myself have no Igbo or Nigerian background, and it was really refreshing and interesting to see many of these different dynamics and customs, especially concerning spirituality. Storytelling also, many of these stories that are told within this novel are interesting themselves, and they kind of give a window into this culture. This was published in 1959, and there are Igbo terms within this novel which give it richness as well. So some of those Igbo terms, there are many of them that are included there, but Achebe typically he'll always explain these terms to an English audience. He's not writing this under the assumption that everyone will know what this means. He's aware of that, and he makes sure to explain these terms. Agbala, one of the deities, which is an important deity in this novel. Agbala is the deity of the future, and she has, I'm not sure if it's a she or he, but the prophetess, the priestess of Agbala is a woman, and she is kind of an interesting character. She doesn't take up too much of the novel, but she has a few interesting chapters. Then there's Igwugu, which are essentially people who dress up as deities. But not anyone can do this. They essentially wear a mask, and they're high-ranking chieftains that sort of impersonate the deities and sort of almost become possessed by the deities. The deities are flowing through them. Very similar to certain other societies. I know, I'm pretty sure the Hawaiian society engaged with something similar, where deities would float through people. Not too different from Christianity as well, when people say, such as, I'm speaking through God. I have a little bit of God within me, which the Quakers believe, and all of that. But in here, it's a bit more in the sense of becoming possessed by the God, in a way, and becoming sort of a vessel to the God, a spokesperson to the God, and an actor of this specific God. There are also specific gods, or chi, and these seem to be unique but also passed down by family. I wasn't exactly sure how much of the chi is related to your parents, or how much it is your own self-journey. It's a bit of a mix of both, perhaps, but the chi are essentially personal gods. So another interesting thing. There's also another interesting term. Before I'll explain, this is kind of all over the place. I'm explaining these terms before the story, which is probably a big faux pas. But bear with me. There's also obanji. Obanji is essentially a child that is cursed, and when their parents give birth and the child dies, or they miscarriage, they have a miscarriage with a child, and it's thought of that when a miscarriage or a child dies young, and when a woman is constantly having this tragedy happen to her, that her children are dying, a child that's being born is dying, that this is actually an obanji. This is a child, a spirit, a sort of wicked, cursed spirit that's possessed in this child, and it's going to the other childs within that woman. And in order to end this streak of suffering, to end this long line, this long progression of miscarriages and early mortalities, the obanji stone, there's a special name for that, but a certain stone by the obanji has to be found and essentially destroyed, I believe. Something like that. It has to be put away. And that becomes a little subplot within this story. Now, what is the story about? So I mentioned this is a tragedy. I also mentioned it's quite panoramic. In some ways, it reminded me of 100 Years of Solitude. The sort of panoramic immersion into this village, this fantastical area. Macondo was it in 100 Years of Solitude. Things fall apart, however, is much more condensed. It's condensed in the life of Okonkwo. It's not generational as much, although he does have children, and they are important elements and characters in this story. And he does obviously mention his father and his mother, his uncle, I believe, as well. So there is a family aspect to it, but it very much is Okonkwo's story. It's about him. It is also not as long as 100 Years of Solitude. 100 Years of Solitude is 400 pages, and it spans, I think, 4 or 5 generations. As I said, this is pretty much just Okonkwo and his family. Now, on the note of family, polygamy is a big thing here. So Okonkwo has 3 wives, and it's kind of good to have a lot of wives. That shows that you're sort of an OG and you've got a lot going for you. You can provide for a lot of people. Some of the talk about women and gender might be a bit alienating, a bit foreign to maybe Western readers. This is just a new culture. This is a certain culture you have to sort of accept and just you don't have to necessarily understand it, but it's a culture that you have to you're privy to. Now, Achebe, I do believe, is quite aware of this sort of gender, I'm not going to say gender issue, but gender is a theme and something that pops up consistently in this book. Now, while Okonkwo is hypermasculine and he is in many ways likable, he is quick to anger, and he doesn't like, stories, those bedtime stories. Those are women's things, and he's very much, I guess you could say, sexist. There are certain things men do, there are certain things women do, and Achebe is quite aware of this. He's quite aware that he has created a character that is sexist. Albeit very, very interesting, and someone that he very much is a proper, he feels like a protagonist out of a heroic epic in many ways. He's got a lot of things going for him, but he is very hot-headed. Now, the tragedy that comes with it. Tragedy that comes with it, as anticipated by many of the readers, although this tragedy does show itself before this, but for the most part, the last third of the book concerns colonization and the British slow overtaking and encroachment of Nigerian culture and lands. First, through missionaries, and it very much really only is missionaries in this book, for the most part. There's other British influences, but it's very much the missionaries. Now, where was I at? I lost a bit of my train of thought. But this tragedy, even before missionaries, white people, Europeans are mentioned in the novel, there is a tragedy that is occurring, or I shouldn't say tragedy necessarily, but you can see the decline of Okonkwo. You can see that there are prophecies are very big in this novel. There are prophecies that sort of are dooming him. There are actions that he is doing that may be leaving curses on himself. Quite a few forays of these incidents happen, and it's only at the end that when Europeans start to convert people to Catholicism, and there's a real tension between cultures, that Okonkwo, in his warlike nature, tries to go out to confront it as best as he can, being a warrior. It's very much a story of pre-colonization. This occurs, I should have mentioned this earlier, but this novel occurs in the late 19th century. So, I believe 1880s, 1890s. I don't think there's an actual date in this book, but I remember doing a bit of research online. I'm pretty sure that's the time period that it occurs. Yeah, you know what? That probably is the time period it occurs in. And the reason you can say that kind of accurately, not as much because I know what's happening and I know what sort of instruments and technology is being used at this time and I can decipher it, but because there's another book. There are actually two other books that follow this trilogy. This is actually a trilogy, believe it or not. And the second book in this trilogy, which is No Longer at Ease, follows Okonkwo's grandson. And Okonkwo's grandson is living in the 50s. I think it's pretty safe to say that he's living in the 50s. Maybe late 40s. Definitely after World War II. So we can kind of decipher that Okonkwo would be the late 19th century or perhaps even the early 20th century, this novel. Now, it is a trilogy. However, it seems to be very, very much in name. Yes, there are characters. Obviously, it's Okonkwo's grandson in the second novel. But the second novel has a completely different feel in many ways to the first novel. I'm only about halfway through the second novel, but it concerns many different issues from the first novel. A few tangential issues, but it has a completely different feel. For the most part, the tribal, the peeking into this foreign tribal culture is very much lost in the second novel. Now, for the most part, this was a very enjoyable book. I quite like the panoramic nature of it, how it really transported me into this village, this sort of environment and culture. And I would recommend it definitely to anyone looking to get into African literature, perhaps just trying to broaden their own horizons. It's not too long too, as I mentioned. 200 words. It's very easy to read. Anyways, that's it for the video. Hope you have a nice day. Take care.